Hi, I'm here with Jessica Gibb, and my subject is arousal regulation. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jessica Gibb. I am an instructor in the exercise physiology program within the Department of Health and Sports Sciences. And I've been an instructor here at U of L for 5 years now. And previous to that, I received my master's degree in exercise physiology from the University of Louisville.
Awesome. So you're from here. Perfect. So first off, what is arousal regulation?
All right, arousal regulation is first being able to understand and increase self-awareness of your arousal states. Secondly, it helps you to identify the techniques that you could use to raise arousal during competition, so specifically for athletes in particular. It also allows you to use somatic, cognitive, and multimodal anxiety reduction techniques in order to manage stress, especially related to competition.
That's awesome. So why is arousal regulation good?
Well, continued pressure for athletes can, over time, lead to a lot of different things, including overtraining syndrome. It can lead to burnout for exercise and training. It can lead to other physical effects like migraines or ulcers, and even hypertension in a well-trained athlete. Ultimately, arousal regulation can help to eliminate those things long term, so it can help to prevent that from being an issue for your athletes, especially when they have a lot going on, including academics, and then their training, and then competition, so it just helps to manage all of that. There's several practices and techniques that they can use, and the first step in being able to control your arousal levels is ultimately to be able to understand them and notice them, so to actually identify that they exist. And different athletes are going to respond to these things in different ways, so it will depend upon the individual. It would depend upon their sport. For example, a golfer may respond differently to stress than that of a wrestler, just based upon the difference in their sport. Or even athletes on a similar team could respond differently based upon their position. So the relation between arousal and performance can be very complex because of those things. But ultimately, athletes in a competitive environment are going to benefit from being able to control those levels. So once they are able to understand their anxiety and potential stress levels, then they can facilitate different techniques to help control them moving forward and hopefully prevent any of those negative physical aspects that we talked about earlier.
That's great. So how do you increase your arousal levels? What are some techniques you can use?
Well, the first step toward being able to control your arousal levels, like I said earlier, is to be aware of them and know that they're present. So understanding them through recognition during practice and or competition would be very important. Then you want to be able to reflect upon them so that moving forward you can manage any negative stress, negative stressors that may have impacted your performance. So, for example, one technique might be to think back to your best performance when stress was not having a negative impact upon anything related to competition, and then visualize that. What was good about that performance? What went right on that day? How were you able to manage your stress? And kind of make a checklist in your head to be able to go back to that and think, all right, how did I manage any stressors that came up in order to allow for my best performance? And then do the same thing by thinking about your worst performance and what might have gone wrong there in your inability to manage stressors that could have been present on that day. And then do the same thing, think back to how I could have prevented it, or if you feel like you couldn't have prevented it, how could we find some ways to manage that stress moving forward? Then beyond that, once you've kind of identified things that are stressors for you, there are different techniques to help alleviate those. So there are some somatic-based techniques that would include things like progressive relaxation or breath control. There are cognitive techniques, which are going to be kind of more along the lines of thinking positively and being able to have an awareness of the arousal state and the stressors, perhaps using something like meditation to help relax yourself when they become an issue. And then with multimodal anxiety techniques, those are going to be things like hypnosis that could assist. And I would say perhaps when the stressors get to be to the point where traditional somatic or cognitive technique doesn't work, that something like that might be necessary.
Awesome. So in our textbook, it talks about the matching hypothesis. Can you tell me a little bit more about the matching hypothesis?
So matching hypothesis is going to attempt to determine which of these techniques is going to allow for the maximum effectiveness, depending upon what arousal or stressors are going to be most impactful for an individual athlete.
Gotcha.
So a management technique for your anxiety or your stress should match what that stressor actually is. So for example, mental relaxation may be better for something that is more cognitively stressing you, where a somatic technique would be better for something that is more of a physical stressor. So maybe physical relaxation, like the breath control we mentioned earlier, would be better in that case.
That's awesome. So do you have any specific advice to maybe help athletes cope with competitive stress while they're actually competing?
Well, there are a couple different types of coping mechanisms that athletes can use. Problem-focused coping is going to allow them to kind of talk a little bit about what we discussed earlier, where they're kind of thinking through that mental checklist of what tends to be an issue for them, and allowing themselves to goal set and how to kind of move past that, and use time management effectively, especially when athletes are trying to manage their classes and their practice schedules. Time management will be huge for them, so finding a way to better allow themselves to do that. Then there's also emotion-focused coping mechanisms, which are going to focus more on managing the strong emotional responses that we can have to stress instead. Beyond that, some examples of things that you could use specifically would be allowing the athlete to think rationally and kind of use self-talk to remind themselves that this particular stressor may not be, it may seem like a really big deal in this moment in time, but in the big picture, the grand scheme of things, it's probably not that big of a deal. So just reminding yourself of that, because we can always get caught up in the emotional response in a moment. Keeping themselves positive and focusing on those positive thoughts. Allowing the athletes to work with someone who can help prepare them for any potential unexpected events, and having someone to rely on for that. And then finally, things like psychological skills, including the use of a routine, the use of mentally preparing themselves for competition or practice, or the anxiety of an exam in class, can all be assisted there. There is definitely a very delicate balance between them training effectively and then pushing themselves too hard. So using all of these mechanisms can help them keep that balance.
That's awesome. So actually in this class, we talked about Michael Phelps and how his coach actually stepped on his goggles while he was competing to actually induce for those stressors. Do you think this plays a part in that, and this actually, that would be a huge step because of arousal regulation?
I think most definitely. I think being able to mentally prepare for those types of things that you can't control for sometimes would be helpful. And so I think having someone like a coach or an instructor or an academic advisor to help you prepare for that, even if it's something like stepping on your goggles to prepare that this could happen right before a competition, can be helpful.
So what are some techniques that you can help with arousal regulation in everyday settings, not just the competitive setting?
So in everyday settings, of course, even individuals who aren't athletes, everybody is going to experience highs and lows of stress and arousal. And so being able to be prepared to handle those is going to be very important when you're at school, when you're at work, and of course just in your day-to-day life, because we always have things that come up in personal lives as well. So some things that you can do would be keeping in mind that if you feel like your heart rate or your breathing rate is starting to rise, how can you better control that? So taking deep breaths and focusing on managing that stress and kind of taking a moment for yourself to reflect on it and just breathe before you have an emotional response or you immediately react to something.
Gotcha.
If you're having a day where you feel really tired or lethargic, which we all do, try to encourage yourself to be energized anyway, because the more you focus on the fact that you're tired or you're feeling lethargic, but you have all these things to do, that's just going to increase your stress levels, and you're going to feel even more tired. So, and then it kind of affects you mentally. So being able to just remind yourself, even though I'm not feeling the best today, I have to get through my day, so I'm going to encourage myself to be as energized as possible. Using positive statements and positive thoughts. I think I mentioned this earlier as well. The mind can always have an effect on your physical state. So the power of positive thinking, it actually works. So encouraging yourself to do that. And then finally, most people have positive reactions to listening to music, whether it be when they're studying, when they're exercising. It can be motivational. It can help you get through something that is challenging. And then for a lot of people, they can also find it really relaxing as well. So it can help be sort of an alternative to something like breath control or meditation to manage stress.
Great. I think we got some really good stuff covered. I just wanted to say thanks for sitting down and talking with me. It was really good. Thanks.